Shower and 82. Currently 74 in Gastonia, 73 in the Queen City. Boomer Von Cannon, WBT.
Huh? It's 5:05 and welcome into a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Also streaming this morning live on the Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Well, the top story this morning across really the entire southeastern half of the United States is Hurricane Helene. And that storm is, well, leaving her mark across portions of the entire southeast portion of the United States this morning. As of just minutes ago, the latest details from the National Hurricane Center out of Miami, Florida. Helene has now weakened officially to a tropical storm as it moves further inland over portions of Georgia. Helene made landfall in Florida's Big Bend region shortly after 11 p.m. last night. Thursday at landfall, the storm was a massive and destructive Category 4 hurricane with maximum sustained winds up to 140 miles an hour. Taking a look at the latest advisory from the National Hurricane Center, it is once again a tropical storm. Its winds at 70 miles an hour, pressure 968 millibars, and it's moving quick north at 30 miles an hour. Again, as its center of circulation is over the central part of Georgia this morning. Turning our attention to impacts here in North Carolina, catastrophic flash flooding and the potential for landslides in the mountains western half of the state is a big concern this morning. Wind gusts in some portions of the state could reach 50 to 60 miles an hour, downing trees and allowing for widespread power outages. As of right now, there are almost 100,000 customers in North Carolina without power. Most of that is centralized and localized out to the west this morning. Just a quick note, the highest winds locally are going to be expected in this morning hour. So over the next couple of hours as we get into the afternoon, the likelihood of that should die down as the storm continues to weaken. So those highest local winds are expected this morning. Tropical storm warnings are in effect for a large portion of the state, including the Charlotte metro area. We will continue tracking Helene this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Turning our attention to the North Carolina port at Wilmington. Contingency plans are underway this morning as a potential strike by the International Longshoremen's Association could take effect early next week, and that could impact not only the port in Wilmington, but ports all over the east coast of the United States and ports in the Gulf. While North Carolina ports are not directly involved in the labor dispute, they are very much reliant on third-party workers, including members of the International Longshoremen's Association. Contingency measures include closing certain port operations and modifying procedures at the Port of Wilmington. It's important to note that a strike could severely disrupt supply chains across the entire southeast portion of the United States, affecting the upcoming holiday season and leading to potential shortages and price hikes here in the Tar Heel State. If this were to go into effect, all vessels must complete work and vacate the berth at the Port of Wilmington by 11:59 p.m. on Monday. That's September the 30th. The contract runs out at midnight on the 30th. So we'll know come late Monday and into parts of early Tuesday morning whether that strike is officially going to take place. We'll continue to track that throughout the weekend. Jeff Moore from the Carolina Journal joins us with some additional details coming up here in just a couple of minutes. It's now 5:09 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. New analysis from researchers at the John Locke Foundation are scrutinizing Governor Roy Cooper's claims against the Opportunity Scholarship Program in the state of North Carolina, including assertions that programs divert funds from public education. The experts determined Cooper's widely promoted attacks on school choice Well, they don't actually align with reality. The General Assembly recently passed House Bill 10, which fully funds the Opportunity Scholarship Program across the state and clears a nearly 55,000 student waiting list. Last week, Governor Roy Cooper vetoed that school choice legislation, citing numerous drawbacks in his veto message. One concern that Cooper continues to mention and has voiced frequently for years is that the expanding school choice in the state of North Carolina takes away money from public school funding. He argues that the bill takes taxpayer dollars from public schools and gives them to private school vouchers. However, according to the report by the John Locke Foundation, the money allotted for the Opportunity Scholarship Program is not sourced from the public school budget. Instead, Opportunity Scholarship funding is administered via the UNC portion of the state's education budget, while the North Carolina public school funding is administered via appropriations from the Department of Public Instruction. The analysis reads as follows. In short, the OSP, Opportunity Scholarship, does not divert money from public schools because it is funded through a different part of the state budget. The report also counters the claims of helping wealthier families, explaining that the Opportunity Scholarship Program uses a sliding scale in which lower income families receive larger scholarship amounts. The scale shows a performance for supporting low and moderate income families with greater scholarship amounts. The average awards range from between $7,500 for students in lower income tiers to just over $3,000 for students whose families are in the higher income tiers. Another claim from Governor Roy Cooper is that private school vouchers do not improve student performance, and while a few scattered studies may provide the results that the governor continues to mention, a meta-study of nearly 190 schools shows otherwise. About 84% of the 190 studies show a positive effect of choice in education. 10% showed no significant impact at all, and only 6% showed a negative result. Of 29 studies that evaluated school choice program impacts on public school test scores, 26 showed a positive effect, 1 found no visible effect, and 2 found a negative effect. And while the governor has clearly expressed his disapproval of the bill, the General Assembly, which currently has a supermajority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate, is likely to override the governor's veto in the coming months. As we sit here less than 40 days out from Election Day, optics very much are on the front minds of all House members as they aim to secure their election bid. It is uncertain whether the House will hold veto overrides before the election. However, it is important to note that the General Assembly will convene for a one-day session coming up in, at this point, less than 2 weeks, October the 9th. That's a Wednesday when that could bring a potential override vote. The House must first override the bill before the Senate can take action. However, the Senate does not have any scheduled votes for October the 9th. In November, the legislature will convene for a longer period of time between November the 19th and November the 22nd. So we will continue to track the House Bill 10. We've talked about that a lot, and the Opportunity Scholarship Program. You can read more about the John Locke study. We've got an article this morning over on our website, CarolinaJournal.com. It's now 5:14 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Weather's on everybody's mind this morning. Let's get a look at the roads with Boomer Von Cannon.
You got it, Nick Keller.
Pete Kaliner. Today, noon to 3. WBT.
Your emergency situation station.
5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on a busy Friday morning. News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Well, Hurricane Helene, our top story this morning, is no more. As of just moments ago from the National Hurricane Center, Helene has officially weakened to a tropical storm as the center of that circulation is now over portions of central Georgia. The storm, however, was incredibly powerful as it made its landfall in the Big Bend region shortly before midnight last night. At landfall, the storm was in fact a Category 4 hurricane with the very destructive 140-mile-per-hour winds. Catastrophic flash flooding and the potential for landslides in the mountains, the western half of our state, is the big concern this morning. Wind gusts in some areas could reach 50 to 60 miles an hour. That is why there are flash flood warnings and tropical storm warnings from the mountains all the way to the Charlotte metro. The highest winds locally are expected Friday morning as those tropical storm warnings do continue. As of right now, there are about 90,000 customers without power in the state of North Carolina, and most of that is localized out to our west. Turning our attention to Washington, D.C. this morning, Republican lawmakers led by Representative Dan Bishop, who is the Republican candidate for Attorney General here in North Carolina, as well as Senator Chuck Grassley, are demanding transparency from the Biden administration regarding the handling of over 500,000 unaccompanied migrant children. They accuse the Department of Health and Human Services of insufficiently vetting sponsors, leading to child exploitation, abuse, and human trafficking. The letter was signed by over 40 lawmakers and calls for immediate action to locate missing children and improve oversight. The lawmakers emphasize that protecting these children is a bipartisan issue. A quote in the letter reads as follows: "Even as the trafficking business and the number of children entering the United States surged, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Settlement cut back significantly on background checks and vetting procedures to speed up the process, despite knowing that children were being trafficked through HHS's Office of Refugee Resettlement Program. Your administration," writing to the Biden administration, "your administration likewise continued Vice President Harris's longtime priority of cutting back on information sharing between HHS and law enforcement related to unaccompanied children and sponsors." The full letter is quite the interesting read, and that is available this morning. It's currently our top story over at CarolinaJournal.com. It's now 5:23. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Some shakeups next week in southeastern North Carolina could not only have an impact here in the Tar Heel State, but could impact really parts of the entire southeastern portion of the United States. Joining us to get more details on what's going on down at the port in Wilmington, I'd like to welcome Jeff Moore from the Carolina Journal back to the show this morning. Jeff, pretty big news and a pretty big situation unfolding early next week down in Wilmington.
Yeah, it looks like this could be something that affects people nationwide. So we've got negotiations between the International Longshoremen's Association, which is the union that represents dock workers at ports across the country. They've got a contract that's due to expire on September 30th, and they can't negotiate a new contract yet, so they're threatening a strike that would go into place on October 1st. Now, North Carolina's got two ports of consequence commercially. We got the port in Morehead City and the port of Wilmington. The port of Wilmington actually has some contingency plans here that will shut down container operations at the port. If this strike does come to pass, they're going to honor all work stoppages. And so any boats looking to unload any materials, any reefer containers, refrigerated containers that are on the port there, won't be allowed to be worked on. No ships will be coming in. Nothing will be coming off of those boats if there's a work stoppage in place. And so retailers across North Carolina, businesses and consumers are a little bit worried about what could happen here in North Carolina and around the country, really.
You know, it seems like not that long ago, Jeff, we were talking about this on the national level. Out on the West Coast, there was miles and miles of freight and container ships that were sitting in the port of Los Angeles. Even to this day, you go into stores and talk to people and say, hey, where's this product? And they'll say, oh, supply chain issues. That's why that's not available. Is that this is an integral part of the supply chain, is it not?
Yeah, it certainly is. And so business groups are really worried that we could have a repeat of those supply chain disruptions that we saw in 2021, those extensions from the pandemic policies that really disrupted manufacturing and human resourcing in many parts of our economy. So we've got a bottleneck here, too. If we've got about 45,000 dock workers that are covered by these contracts on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. The West Coast workers are covered by a different contract. But these Gulf Coast and East Coast workers at about 36 ports could go on strike, and they handle all sorts of products at these ports, all sorts of resources that are coming into the country. So we've got businesses here that are waiting on raw materials to come into the port or refrigerated products to go stock grocery store shelves, anything that's coming by ship on a container into the Port of Wilmington. If this strike goes into place, that's going to be held up, and not just in Wilmington, but at ports across the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. So you could have some really elongated disruptions. Talked to the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association for this article that we have on CarolinaJournal.com, and they're really worried about the economic impact this could have on the state, on the small businesses, the big businesses, and the consumers all the same.
When you talk about economic impact, obviously from this shutdown, it might be important to note of the huge economic impact that the port has normally on the state of North Carolina. You mentioned the Morehead City port. That's a lot smaller, but the Port of Wilmington, for folks that have never driven by it, I'm sure folks have vacationed out at the beaches near Wilmington. But Jeff, it's a massive operation over there at the port.
Yeah, it is a big boy operation compared to. I grew up in Morehead City, so I'm very familiar with the port there. And when you see the port in Wilmington, you understand it's of a different order of magnitude. And they've got serious containerized shipping operations at the Port of Wilmington. They also have an expanded capacity for cold storage. They've got these new cold treatment facilities that expands its ability to actually move products that require refrigeration. And that's not just frozen food products, but that's medical products, the things like plasma that are coming in. So when you have disruptions of this kind at an operation of that size, you could really see ripple effects throughout the economy.
Accurate to say if this were to go forward early next week, not only obviously you'd have the port workers that are on strike, but then, Jeff, it's fair to say that you've got all of the transportation hubs, the 18-wheelers, the stuff that's moved by train. I presume a lot of that stuff kind of screeches to a halt as well because there's not going to be any product to move.
Yeah, as far as exports out of the port, some of those operations are going to be running as normal, but anything importing, so anything in the intermodal or the rail that's bringing these containers off of the ships and then shipping them throughout the region, those things are going to stop. So it's going to have domino effects throughout, and the port in Wilmington represents a pretty big economic impact to the state. But beyond that, all the products that we get through land routes and transportation, we have an inland port in Charlotte that's going to be running normally if there is a strike. But everything else that comes over our interstates, it's arriving at our shores at a port somewhere, and that port's very likely to be affected by this strike if it comes to pass on October 1st. So this is probably going to be an election issue as well, honestly. If there is an elongated work stoppage in October, just weeks before the election, and that can't be resolved. This is the Biden administration really trying to make a deal happen here, but it looks like there's a stalemate. And so that could be an issue that bleeds right into Election Day.
Do you have any details on the strike? Why is this coming to fruition? Is this just a contract that's up? What are the details that you learned about that?
Yeah, so their current contract covers Gulf Coast and East Coast ILA members. And it expires on September 30th. And so some of these, some of the battle lines are pretty typical. It's about their total compensation packages and what they're going to get. From what I understand, they have been offered raises, but they have not quite met the mark. So the union is rejecting that offer, and they're kind of digging their heels in. And the latest is that there's a stalemate, so there's no real movement here. So people are starting to hold their breath as we get closer and closer to the drop dead date of September 30th. So if at 11:59 p.m. on September 30, they don't have a deal in place, then this work stoppage is going to go into effect.
Jeff Moore joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. 5:30, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Some rain starting to fall across the Charlotte Metro this morning. Let's get a look at traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Weather.
537, it's the Carolina Journal News Hour. I'm Nick Craig, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Our top story this morning, continuing to track effects from what was Hurricane Helene. Around 5 o'clock this morning, the National Hurricane Center has downgraded that storm to a tropical storm as the center of its circulation is now over portions of central Georgia. However, despite the weakening, the storm is still expected to bring strong winds and several inches of rain to portions of both North and South Carolina. Taking a look this morning at what's going on out at our mountains where the biggest impacts are being felt, rescue crews are stationed throughout that area as the tropical storm drenches the area in rain. At least one water rescue has already been performed in Avery County. The county fire marshal said that the rescue happened around 3 o'clock this morning in the Altamont area after a stream caused flooding, stranding people living in a nearby home. First responders from multiple agencies were called in to assist. On a Wednesday night, the Charlotte Fire Department's Swift Water Rescue Team was deployed to western North Carolina, where they are stationed this morning to help with whatever rescues might need to take place. And learning some details out of Buncombe County this morning, 2 shelters that were opened in that area are closing immediately. They are evacuating individuals from those emergency shelters to different shelters and transporting those as those floodwaters continue to rise. A very chaotic morning here throughout really the entire southeastern half of the United States. Taking a look at some other news this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour, a recent report from the John Locke Foundation challenges North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper's claims that Opportunity Scholarships harm public education by diverting funds. Experts argue that the scholarships are funded separately from public schools, favor low-income families, and improve student outcomes. They also refute Governor Cooper's assertion that the program benefits only wealthy families in the state. The General Assembly is expected to override Governor Roy Cooper's veto of House Bill 10. That's the bill that is expanding the Opportunity Scholarship Program. That could happen sometimes next month or potentially into the later parts of November after the big election coming up early that month. It's now 5:39 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. The federal debt seems to be a looming conversation that takes place year after year here in the United States. I'd like to welcome Chris Towner to the program this morning. He is with the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. He joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Chris, good morning to you. First of all, let's start at the top. What is the current national debt and why should anybody care about it?
Yeah, I think the number most people know about with the national debt is $35 trillion, right? That's the gross national debt. That includes about $7 trillion that the U.S. government owes itself. So I think about it more about as around $28 trillion. And then I even think about it in a more wonky term, which is the share of the economy. So the national debt is roughly the size of the economy right now. And that's pretty massive. We haven't seen that level since just after World War II. And we're going to exceed that level that we experienced in World War II in just 3 years. And we're just going to skyrocket right past it. So it's pretty huge, and it is very unsustainable, growing at an unsustainable pace.
You just mentioned that it's the size of the economy, so let's break it down. If you're an individual, you make $30,000 a year and you have $30,000 in credit card debt, is that kind of an equivalent situation, Chris? It'd be very hard to pay down that debt and also live your life when those numbers are essentially the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's close. It's really hard to compare it to the household budget, though, because most people can't borrow at the rate that the U.S. government can.
Sure.
But yeah, it's about owning much more debt or just as much as you take in on an annual basis. And it's not sustainable for anyone.
This is not a new issue, unfortunately. The conversation about the federal debt has existed for quite some time. And Chris, it seems like it's one of these things that, yeah, we hear about it on election years, but has anything actually realistically been done with that in modern times? And what's kind of the path going forward?
Yeah, unfortunately, over the last few years, we've really just borrowed quite a bit. That made a lot of sense during 2020 and 2021 when COVID hit. But really, we're just putting the foot on the accelerator at this point. Lawmakers like to enact new programs, but they don't like to pay for them. Unfortunately, paying for things requires either cutting spending elsewhere or raising people's taxes, and neither side likes to do either of those for anyone anymore.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because either way, it's an unpopular stance. So when you hear, though, you'll see plenty of interviews this election cycle from individuals on both the Republican and Democrat side of the aisle, Chris, and they'll say, yeah, we're going to handle debt. We're going to be more fiscally responsible. Is that just more wishful thinking than anything else, or do they actually mean it?
Yeah, it generally is more wishful thinking. There are not that many politicians that are really serious about those things, especially we're looking at next year. Like, it doesn't matter who becomes president. It doesn't matter what Congress looks like. We're looking at some pretty big policy expirations. The Trump tax cuts will expire in 2025. At that point, we got to figure out, are we going to pay for extending them? Are we going to extend them just by adding more to the debt? And if we do just add to the debt, that's another $4 trillion to permanently extend them and add to the debt. I don't really see either side of the aisle really talking about how we would pay for that right now.
So now I guess I'll ask you the question. How do we begin chipping away at this? This is not something that you do in a night or a year or a couple of months. This is a long-term plan that has to go into place to start whittling down this debt. What's step one in all of this, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, the first step is admitting we have a problem, right? We need lawmakers
Sure.
to actually admit that we have a problem and that we need to deal with it. The next step is really to take the three big buckets that no one wants to talk about and put them on the table. So that's taxes, that's Social Security, and that's Medicare. Unfortunately, Social Security and Medicare are both of the largest programs in the federal budget and what's driving a lot of increased federal spending over the next decade. If we're going to even try to tackle this issue, we're going to have to make changes to those programs, especially because both programs rely on trust funds that fund them. Both of them will have trust funds that exhaust in the next 12 years. For Social Security, that means just 9 years away, the retirement trust fund will be exhausted. At that point, the law says that we have to cut benefits across the board by 21%. I don't think anyone thinks that that's a realistic point of view, right? Like, that's not going to happen. We need to make changes that put it on a sustainable trajectory. That means probably lowering future benefits for folks like myself, and it probably means asking people to pay more into the trust fund.
As we go forward with this, and I'm glad you brought up some of these larger programs, I've seen pie charts before, Chris, and it talks about the amount of non-discretionary spending that actually makes up the federal budget. That percentage amount is sometimes in the single digits, if not maybe low teens, 12, 14, 15%. The rest of this stuff is things that politicians don't want to touch. It's hard to get elected on cutting Social Security or cutting other sorts of federal programs that people rely on. It's a real toxic issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 3/4 of the federal budget is essentially on autopilot, right? That's interest on the national debt, and that's the other 2/3 of federal spending that is mandatory programs, Social Security, Medicare, federal healthcare programs, safety net programs. A lot of politicians don't really want to talk about touching those. Well, then you're just leaving 1/4 of the budget, which is half defense and half non-defense discretionary programs. Those are not easy ones to tackle either, and we've already tried tackling them. We actually have caps on those programs right now, and if we want to make significant progress in the future, we're going to have to go after those bigger pots.
Well, and to follow up on that, I think the idea is, if Congress just stops spending money, this problem solves itself. With it being such a little portion of this whole conversation, Chris, is that even accurate? Let's just say Congress cut all the non-discretionary spending to zero. Do we still have a problem?
Yeah, we still do have a problem. Even if you cut like all discretionary spending programs that Congress decides on annually to zero, you'd be having a small deficit still, but it'd still be a deficit, right? And we also wouldn't have a military, and we wouldn't have like any of the big programs that people think about that the federal government does. We wouldn't have the Department of Education, Labor, EPA, transportation. We wouldn't have any of those. We'd just be essentially a large insurance company. We'd be Social Security and Medicare and other federal healthcare programs.
Chris Towner joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. 546 News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Some folks waking up this morning wondering what the commute looks like. Let's get an update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. And we have
Alex Coakley, this morning at 10. WBT.
Your emergency situation station.
5:51. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. The name Helene is on everybody's name this morning. Just before we were on the air at 5 o'clock, the National Hurricane Center reporting that Helene has weakened to a tropical storm as it moves further over portions of inland Georgia as of this morning. The storm, however, was very strong when it made landfall in the Big Bend region of Florida last night around 11 p.m. When it did make landfall, the storm was a Category 4 hurricane with maximum sustained winds around 140 miles an hour. Our impacts across North Carolina this morning continue to be catastrophic flash flooding and the potential for landslides in the mountain and foothill communities. That's the big concern. Wind gusts in many areas could reach 50 to 60 miles an hour, downing trees and allowing for widespread power outages. As of right now, there are just about 85 or so thousand customers without power in North Carolina. Most of that is localized in the western half of the state. The highest winds locally are expected this morning, and a tropical storm warning is in effect for a large portion of the state, including the Charlotte metro area. There is also a state of emergency that is in effect. Governor Roy Cooper enacting that just a couple of days ago. We'll continue to track that throughout the morning. The North Carolina ports, specifically the Port of Wilmington, are preparing contingency plans as a potential strike by the International Longshoremen's Association, or ILA, looms, which could impact not only the port in Wilmington and Morehead City, but ports all along the East and Gulf Coast. While the North Carolina ports are not directly involved in the labor dispute that's going on, they are in fact reliant on third-party workers, including those that are members of the Longshoremen's Association. Contingency measures include closing certain operations and modifying procedures at the Port of Wilmington. A strike could severely disrupt supply chains, affect holiday season buying, and lead to shortages and price hikes across North Carolina and portions of the entire southeast portion of the United States. If this were to go into effect, it would take place around 11:50 p.m. on Monday night. That's September the 30th. That is when the contract is set to expire. And if that was the case, flip the clock over to Tuesday morning at 12:01 a.m. and the strike would be taking place, and there would be major holdups at ports all along the East Coast and Gulf Coast. We'll continue to track that throughout the weekend right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. A recent report from the John Locke Foundation challenges North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper's claims that the Opportunity Scholarship Program is harming public education by diverting funds. Experts from the Locke Foundation argue that scholarships are funded separately from public schools, favor low-income families, and improve student outcomes. The report also refutes Cooper's assertion that the program benefits only the wealthiest families in our state. The General Assembly is expected to override Governor Roy Cooper's veto of House Bill 10. He vetoed that legislation last week. The General Assembly, at least the House side, is back in session in less than 2 weeks. It will have to go through the House and Senate again to clear a nearly 55,000 student wait list that exists here in the state. And up in Washington, D.C. this morning, Republican lawmakers led by Representative and Attorney General candidate Dan Bishop are demanding transparency from the Biden administration regarding the handling of over 500,000 unaccompanied migrant children. They accuse the Department of Health and Human Services of insufficiently vetting sponsors, leading to child exploitation, abuse, and human trafficking. A letter signed by over 40 lawmakers calls for immediate action to locate missing children and improve oversight in the program. Lawmakers emphasize that protecting these children is in fact a bipartisan issue. Reading from some of the letter that was sent to the Biden administration, it reads, "Even as the trafficking business and the number of children entering the United States surged, Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement cut back significantly on background checks and vetting procedures to speed up that process, despite knowing that children were being trafficked through HHS's Office of Refugee Resettlement program. Your administration, speaking to the Biden administration, likewise continued Vice President Harris's longtime priority of cutting back on information sharing between HHS and law enforcement related to unaccompanied children and their sponsors. This is a long letter. It's 9 pages signed by over 40 lawmakers, subject to both Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Chuck Grassley's office has been working to find children that are so far unaccounted for, and he said lawmakers are not getting the cooperation that they would want from the Biden-Harris administration. You can read more about that story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. Well, that's going to do it for a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. The latest WBT news is next, followed by Good Morning BT. Hey, I'm filling in for Vince Coakley today, so hopefully you can join me from 10 till noon. If not, we're back Monday morning, 5 a.m. right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Have a safe Friday and a nice weekend. We're back Monday morning, starting at 5.
You're clear, brother. Great show.